So we are on part 3 of our introduction to anatomy, and today we're going to be talking through body planes and anatomical terminology. I want to start by talking through anatomical position. So the image over here on the right-hand side shows you a body in anatomical position in which the body is standing straight, the body upright and facing the observer. Toes are forward, palms are facing forward, and thumbs point away from the body. As we talk through all of these different terms and different body planes, you'll notice that all of the diagrams have images of individuals that are in anatomical position. This kind of makes it a fair playing field or level playing ground so that we always know exactly how the body is positioned when referring to different areas or using these directional terms. An important part of this class is understanding directional terminology, especially when we use it for guidance during our dissections or when we're talking in class about where particular body parts or organs are located. So we have two individuals here in anatomical position with lots of different arrows and words that are surrounding them and kind of pointing in the direction that these directional terms are referring to. Now, most of these you probably haven't seen, but some of them may be familiar. I'm obviously not going to go through what right and left mean, but I do want to point out that in the image on the left-hand side, the woman that's facing us, when you have a body in anatomical position and we're referring to these diagrams or looking at images in a textbook or on your online textbook, you need to remember that right and left are flipped because that person is viewing you. So your right and your left are opposite of what we are seeing in this particular image. So remember that it's flipped because that specimen, that organism, that person is actually facing us. From there, we have these sets of directional terms, and we use these in reference when we are trying to talk or compare where one body structure is or where one organ is in comparison to another. So with superior and inferior, I'm not talking about one organ being better than the other or, far less than the other. Instead, I'm talking about location. So for instance, we would use the word superior to reference and say that the nose is superior to the heart. Notice that I use two structures there and I compare the two. So you have to make it in relation to another structure. You can't just say the nose is superior. Well, what does that mean? So instead you have to say the nose is superior to the heart. The nose is superior to the knee. It's above it. So in this particular situation, superior is meaning above another structure. Inferior, of course, is going to mean below a structure. So with inferior, we're going to use that to say the belly button is inferior to the chin. The knee is inferior to the belly button. So this is meaning below. Our next two are anterior, which is also interchanged with ventral, and then posterior or dorsal. So with these two terms, anterior or ventral means towards the front, whereas posterior and dorsal means towards the back. So a good example of this, and again, you have to use two structures or terms to kind of reference each other when you're using these words. So the sternum or the breastbone is anterior to the shoulder blade or your scapula. And then from there, you could flip that and say the scapula is posterior to the sternum or the breastbone. So that scapula is behind or toward the back in reference to the sternum. Proximal and distal are probably the two words that give my students the most difficulty, and these refer to a point of contact. So specifically, we're looking at the torso of the body being the contact point. We use the words proximal and distal to refer to structures on the appendages. So if you notice, we have proximal and distal here on the legs. It's showing again over on the lateral view on the right side, and then proximal and distal also show up on the arms of the image on the left side. Proximal and distal, they are going to be used to basically show where a structure is in reference to that point of attachment. So something is proximal if it's closer to the point of attachment, so it's in closer proximity, whereas distal is the further distance. So for instance, the knee is proximal to the ankle. It's in close distance or closer proximity to that point of attachment, which is your torso, in comparison to the ankle. On the flip of that, the ankle is distal to the knee. It's a further distance away from the point of contact on the torso. So again, if we were to use this with the arm as our reference and look at structures of the arm, we could say that the elbow is proximal to the wrist. it's closer to the point of attachment, which is at the shoulder, or up into the shoulder and then over to the torso. If we flip that, the wrist is distal to the elbow. It's a further distance away. So again, we use these with our appendages, and we're going to use these in reference to structures that are present on the arms and the legs. We're also going to see these pop up when we're talking through phalanges. We'll say, so the phalanges of the feet and then the phalanges of the hands have names in reference, or part of their names use proximal and distal to show you where they are on the hand. From there, we've got the midline coming down, the anatomical position, body that is anterior, facing forward. We're looking at an anterior view here. And so the midline is there in the center, and we have two additional words, medial and lateral. And so medial means more towards that midline, lateral means away from the midline. So for instance, you could say something like the sternum or the breastbone is medial to the shoulders. The nose is medial to the shoulders, so it's more towards the midline. On the flip of that, you could say something like the shoulders are lateral to the breastbone. They go out to the side, they're away from the midline in comparison to the breastbone. Practice makes perfect, y'all. So let's practice using these directional terms to describe where certain structures are in reference to others of the body. We'll use superior and inferior first, and our first example is the head is what to the belly button? Well, your head is above your belly button, so therefore it's superior. The hip is what to the shoulder? Well, the hip is below the shoulder, so it's inferior. For proximal and distal, the wrist is what to the elbow? So when you're looking at your wrist and comparing it to the location of the elbow and referencing where it's attached, where it comes and attaches to the torso, the wrist is distal to the elbow. It's a further distance away from that point of attachment. The ankle is what to the toes? Well, the ankle is proximal to the toes. It's in closer proximity to the point of attachment, the torso. With medial and lateral, the ears are what to the nose? Well, the ears are lateral to the nose. They're out to the side or away from the midline. The sternum or your breastbone is what to the shoulders? It's medial to the shoulders. It's towards the midline. It's right at the midline. And then anterior and posterior. The gluteus maximus, which is your booty muscle, one of three of them, is what to the patella? Well, it's going to be posterior, so we're towards the back. And then the belly button is what to the heel? Well, that's anterior. Your belly button is in front of or towards the front in comparison to the heel of the body. Another pair of directional terms to be familiar with this year are ones that deal with where structures or organs are located within the body. So are they closer to the surface or further away from the surface in the body? And in this diagram, what we have is a live look at me, however many days we are into digital learning. Just kidding. This image is absolutely ridiculous, and I am aware of that, but it makes me laugh every single time, so I can't for the life of me get rid of it and find a different diagram to show you all. It makes me laugh. I have so many questions for whoever is behind the illustration of this, because why did we have to be missing an arm? Why are we missing a lower arm? Just so many questions. I need answers. But anyways, so these terms are superficial and deep. And again, they deal with how structures or organs are located in relation to the surface of the body. So are they closer to the surface or further away? So with superficial, that means closer to the surface. And with deep, that means deeper within or further within the body. And we'll see these terms come up, especially in the muscular unit. I'm going to erase these to show you all this a bit better. But in the muscular unit, we'll talk through superficial and deep muscles. So for instance, over here, we have the superficial muscles. So particularly, let's look at the trapezius right here. When you reflect the trapezius back, which is a superficial muscle, it's more towards the surface, you're going to see deeper muscles. So we have the levator scapulae here that's hidden underneath this trapezius. It's a deeper muscle, and then rhomboid minor and rhomboid major, for example. So to review these directional terms again, we have superior, which is above or towards the head, inferior towards the feet or below. We have medial and lateral. So if we have this midline here, medial is towards the midline, lateral is away from the midline. And then proximal and distal refer to points of attachment. So if this torso is your center attachment or point of attachment, then things like the shoulder is proximal to the elbow. It is in closer proximity to this point of attachment in comparison to the elbow. On the flip of this, you could say that the elbow is distal to the shoulder. Remember, you have to compare and use another structure to make this comparison. So you can't just say the shoulder is proximal. Well, it's proximal to what? And you can't just say the sternum is medial. Well, it's medial to what? There has to be a comparison. Two other terms, I just keep throwing these terms at y'all, but two other terms that your textbook includes and that you'll see a few times are the words cephalic and caudal. So in cephalic and caudal, when using those, cephalic means towards the head, caudal means towards the tail. Now, in some cases, you're going to see inferior and caudal correlate or interchange and superior and cephalic interchange. Well, that's all well and good, but I want to point out that in this image, we have inferior all the way down here. Caudal is stopping here because what caudal means is towards the tail. Well, your tailbone is located right there. And when you're looking at these directional terms in relation to a quadruped animal rather than a bipedal organism like a human, we see some changes. So let's take a look at a quadruped animal with these terms applied to its overall body organization and see where we see some changes. So with this cat, for instance, now ignore the body planes. We're going to get there in just a moment, so we haven't talked through those yet. But in this particular image, we're seeing some of the terms that we've brought up. Now, proximal and distal, they stay the same. We still got this center point of attachment, and from there, we're applying proximal and distal to appendages. So that's all well and good. But when we come back and we're looking at words like anterior and posterior, well, with anterior, if you notice, and with posterior, we have a different word correlating with these. So in a few slides back, we talked through a bipedal organism. So we were looking at a human, and we saw that anterior was correlating or relating to, you could interchange the word with ventral. Well, if you look down here, there's ventral. And with posterior, it was interchangeable with dorsal. Well, that's weird because dorsal's up top there. And instead, we see cranial and caudal being used here, also known as cephalic and caudal. But this means towards the head, cranial or cephalic does, and anterior means towards the front. Well, this is the front of the cat, and that just so happens to be where the head is as well. With posterior and caudal, well, posterior is towards the back, and caudal means towards the tail. Well, check that off because here we are. But then, and as I get rid of all of this, when you look at dorsal and ventral, well, dorsal means towards the back. Yeah, technically this is the back or the back of the cat, but also dorsal literally means the back. So for a human, towards the back and our actual back are in the same direction. But in this case, we have towards the back, towards the tail, and then we have the actual back of the cat. So this is that dorsal portion. Whereas ventral is towards the front and in some cases the abdominal region. Well, that changes up for right here because there's that abdominal region for the cat. So again, a few changes here, which is interesting to see in a quadruped animal. And for right now, I want you to only think of these terms in relation to a human in anatomical position. So I just wanted to show you all this because this will change up when we get to the dissection in the spring semester. Let's round out today's lesson on anatomical terminology and specifically lots of those directional terms by talking through body planes. Now, in this image that's popping up, you see that there are 3 body planes that are all kind of specified or distinguished by different colors. Well, this slide is going to be color-coded to match. So that sagittal plane is going to come up first. And in a sagittal plane, you get the body divided into right and left parts. And I want to specify that I've then further defined the mid-sagittal or the median plane. And with those particular planes, they get equal left and right parts. So with sagittal, you could shift it a little bit further to the right or a little bit further to the left. It doesn't necessarily have to be equal parts, but a sagittal plane nonetheless will give you right and left parts of the body. But a mid-sagittal or median plane will give you equal left and right parts. From there, we have the frontal or the coronal plane, and it's this teal color in the image, and or turquoise, and it's labeled as coronal plane, but sometimes also referred to as frontal plane, so I put both there for you all, but it divides the body into anterior and posterior portions. So you get a front half and a back half, essentially with a coronal plane or coronal cut. And then last but certainly not least, we have the transverse or the horizontal plane, and it's shown in yellow here and labeled as transverse on this image. This divides the body into superior and inferior parts. So you get a top half and a bottom half. And I bring these up, and it's important to understand because when we do these different dissections throughout the year, I will have you all making cuts along these planes. I'll say, make a cut along the sagittal plane of X, Y, and Z, whatever we're dissecting or whatever portion we're looking at. So it's important to understand these body planes and know exactly where they're located. All right, so to truly finish today's lesson, I wanted to give you all one more look at these body planes in a different diagram or a different image. So what we see here, we've got the horizontal plane or that transverse plane in green, and it's dividing the body into superior and inferior portions. That frontal plane is shown there in like a purplish magenta, whatever you want to call it, color, and it's dividing the body into front portions and back portions, so anterior or posterior. Frontal is also coronal. And then when you look at the red and the blue body planes or divisions, you see the median plane is perfectly there in the center. It's aligned. So you get equal right and left portions of the body, whereas the sagittal plane has been shifted a little bit more to one side. So we're seeing still left and right portions, but an unequal distribution of those portions. Hope this helps and hope you guys learned a lot today.